All right, so we're diving into a pretty fascinating topic you've brought us. And it looks like we're going to be exploring asexuality.
Yeah.
You've shared a collection of YouTube videos, and from what I can tell, you're looking for some clarity, like, what exactly is asexuality, what's celibacy, and how are those two things different? I think one thing that's really interesting is how much, like even just at a glance, you can see there's so much misinformation surrounding asexuality.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we're talking about identity,
Right.
separating fact from fiction is super important, and especially with asexuality.
Exactly. And I think that's our mission today as we kind of wade through these videos with you and extract those essential points so you can walk away feeling confident in your understanding of asexuality, celibacy, and the spectrum in between.
Yeah, sounds good.
So I think the Psych2Go video is a good place to start.
Mm-hmm.
And they define asexuality as not experiencing sexual attraction.
Yes, and I think that's a really key point because a lot of people think that it means a lack of all attraction. And that's simply not true. Asexual people can still experience romantic attraction, emotional attraction, platonic attraction.
Sensual attraction.
Even sensual attraction, yeah.
And that's where I think that cake analogy that Blue Phoenix Ace uses is so helpful.
Oh, I love that one.
They compare a cake sexual person to someone who just never desires cake. Like they just don't want it.
Right.
But then a cake abstinent person, they might like cake, they might even enjoy cake, but they're choosing not to eat it.
Exactly.
And I think that analogy is not just clever, it's actually really helpful in debunking that harmful stereotype that asexuality is a choice.
Right. It's not choosing to not eat the cake.
Right.
It's just not desiring the cake.
Right. And I think that brings us to another very important distinction that we need to make, and that's asexuality versus celibacy. And Abby Elizabeth is very clear about this.
Mm-hmm.
They are not the same thing.
Absolutely not.
The channel and Psych2Go videos both define celibacy and abstinence as like an active choice to abstain from sex. It's often temporary, or for specific reasons.
Yeah.
Like it could be religious, it could be personal, it could be, for health reasons, whatever.
Right, exactly.
But asexuality is an inherent orientation.
Exactly. Asexuality is about attraction. Celibacy is about action, or in this case, inaction.
Right. And the channel also highlights that while some asexual people choose celibacy, it's not a given.
Right.
Some asexual people might engage in sexual activity for various reasons.
Of course, yeah.
Like to please a partner or to have children, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we've established that asexuality is about attraction, not action.
Yes.
And so let's maybe move into the historical and societal context a little bit, because the channel video brings up some really interesting historical complexities.
Yes, they talk about, throughout history, how societal pressures and this limited understanding of asexuality has made it difficult for people to, find positive representations of it.
Like, can you imagine trying to understand yourself?
Right.
And like not even having the words
absolutely.
to describe what you're experiencing.
Absolutely.
Like how many people throughout history
I know
might have identified as asexual if they had the language that we have today?
Exactly. And even today, as Tara, Chantel, and the channel hosts were discussing, navigating a hypersexualized world is another layer of complexity for asexual individuals.
So like this constant bombardment of
Yeah.
messaging about like the importance of sex
Yeah.
and relationships when that might not resonate with you
Yeah, exactly.
at all.
Absolutely.
And then we have Astra Martine coming in with a totally different perspective, like an astrological perspective, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
And they suggest that individual differences, which might be reflected in your birth chart, play a role in your desires and how you experience sexuality.
Okay. Yeah, I see.
What are your thoughts on that, like bringing astrology into the conversation about asexuality? Do you think it helps or hurts our understanding?
That's a good question. I think it can be a really cool tool for self-exploration.
Yeah.
But we also have to be very careful not to oversimplify things.
Right.
It's not like, oh, you have this placement, so you're going to be asexual.
Exactly.
It's just one way of looking at a very complex topic.
Totally. And we don't want to generalize because as we're seeing, there are so many different individual experiences and journeys.
Absolutely.
And so speaking of those journeys, what does it actually look like to live as an asexual person in today's world?
Well, Tara Chantel offers some really cool insights into that. She talks about her own journey of self-discovery and how she feels whole and fulfilled without needing a partner. And for her, abstaining from sex has actually contributed to her personal growth and spirituality.
Which I think is so powerful.
Right.
Because it challenges that assumption that we all need this romantic or sexual relationship to be happy. And then we have Living Purified, who offers some advice to a commenter who's considering permanent celibacy. And they really emphasize self-awareness, understanding your motivations for choosing celibacy, like why are you doing this, being honest with partners about your orientation.
Yeah, and I think that advice is not just for asexual people.
Right.
If you are considering celibacy for whatever reason, it's really important to be honest with yourself and your partner and make sure that you're making a choice that's right for you.
Exactly. And they also bring up a really important point, which is that if you're considering celibacy and you think past trauma might be a factor, seeking guidance from a professional could be really helpful.
Absolutely.
Now, before we move on, we need to make one more really crucial distinction, and that is between asexuality and sexual aversion disorder.
Right. And the Psych2Go video does a really good job explaining that.
Right.
And they point out that sexual aversion disorder is a condition where you have this intense fear or anxiety related to sex.
So while asexual individuals might not experience any distress related to their lack of sexual attraction, those with sexual aversion disorder actually do.
Yes, absolutely.
So that's an important thing to keep in mind.
It is.
That, asexuality is a natural variation in human experience. But sexual aversion disorder is a clinical condition that can benefit from professional help.
Exactly.
So, okay, so we've talked about definitions, we've talked about misconceptions, we've talked about personal experiences, and even a little bit of astrology. But I want to kind of dive back into the historical and societal context a little bit more. Because the channel podcast actually dedicates a good portion of their episode to this.
They do.
And they talk about how societal norms throughout history have shaped how we perceive asexuality today.
Right.
Like, I remember them bringing up the idea of romantic friendships between women in the 19th century.
Yes.
These were very close relationships, often, but not expected to be sexual.
Yes. And
it makes you wonder.
It does.
Right,
it makes you wonder how many people throughout history would have identified as asexual if they had the language that we have today.
Right. It's like what's considered normal or acceptable varies so much across time and cultures.
Absolutely.
And one of their guests, Alex Woods, actually cautions against romanticizing the past. While we can learn from these historical examples, it's important to acknowledge that the societal norms back then were often very limiting, especially for women.
Oh, absolutely.
And they brought up those really disturbing examples from like medical history.
Yes.
Where women were labeled hysterical or even institutionalized just for not conforming to expectations around sexuality and marriage.
Yeah, not great.
Like, it's just like, wow, that is a reminder
of
how far we've come, but also
how far we have to go.
How far we have to go. Because even today, as both Alex and Heather Rose Jones point out, asexuality is often pathologized. Like, there has to be.
It has to be something wrong with you.
Yeah, like some medical condition or past trauma.
Yeah, something causing this. Like, you can't possibly just not experience sexual attraction,
Which I guess brings us back to that really important distinction between asexuality and sexual aversion disorder.
Yes, absolutely.
Where asexuality is about a lack of attraction.
Yeah.
But sexual aversion disorder involves a fear or aversion to sex that actually causes significant distress.
Yes.
So with all this historical context in mind, I'm curious about the challenges that asexual individuals face in navigating the world today.
Yeah, well, I think as we touched on before, just constantly being bombarded with messages that emphasize the importance of sex and relationships, that can be really difficult.
Yeah, and Tara Chantel speaks to that directly. She talks about the pressure she's felt to conform to societal expectations, especially as a woman.
Yeah.
And it's like society is telling you
there's only one way.
There's only one way.
To be happy.
Yeah, you have to get married, you have to have kids, you have
to have sex.
Yeah. But her story, I think, is such a great example of how you can find fulfillment outside of those norms.
Absolutely.
She finds meaning and purpose in her spiritual practice.
Yes.
Other areas of her life.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it just highlights the diversity of the asexual experience.
Yeah.
Not everyone chooses celibacy or finds fulfillment in the same way.
Right, exactly.
She also opens up about the judgment that she's faced from people who just don't understand her choices.
Yeah.
Which unfortunately I think is a common experience for a lot of asexual individuals. So what advice does she offer for navigating those kind of negative reactions.
She really emphasizes self-acceptance.
Oh,
Owning your identity and not letting societal pressures dictate your path.
I love that. And that really resonates with what Living Purified was saying about being upfront with potential partners, about your orientation.
Yes, and surrounding yourself with people who are supportive and understanding,
Yeah, like find your tribe.
Find your tribe, exactly.
So it seems like open communication and education are really key.
Mm-hmm.
Like helping others understand that asexuality is a valid orientation. It's not something to be feared or pitied.
Exactly. And that actually brings us to another challenge that comes up in these videos,
Mm-hmm.
the issue of representation.
Yeah, and the channel podcast talks about how the lack of positive and accurate portrayals of asexuality in media and popular culture can contribute to feelings of isolation and invisibility for asexual individuals.
Yeah, and they make the point that this lack of representation makes it harder to educate people
Totally.
and challenge misconceptions.
Right, it's like this
Just
vicious
same
cycle.
products. Yeah, exactly.
But the good news is they also point out that things are starting to change.
They are.
We're seeing more creators and voices like Tara Chantel
Yes.
who are willing to share their experiences
Yes.
and challenge the status quo.
Absolutely.
And I think that's huge because having those diverse voices and stories out there helps to normalize asexuality. And it shows others that they're not alone.
Absolutely.
And speaking of open conversations, Living Purified actually tackles a really important one,
Right.
which is communication in relationships where one partner is asexual and the other isn't.
Right.
And they respond to a commenter who's worried that their lack of sexual desire might be unfair to a potential partner.
Yes.
And I love their advice, which is be upfront
Be upfront.
about your orientation.
Yeah.
And don't feel pressured to conform to expectations that don't feel right for you.
Exactly. If you are not comfortable with something,
Yeah.
don't do it.
And of course, finding a partner who understands and accepts your asexuality is crucial.
Absolutely.
And that speaks to the importance of communication, respect, and understanding
In any relationship.
in any relationship.
Yes.
Now, while we've been talking about the personal and societal aspects of asexuality, Astra Martine offers this totally different perspective, bringing astrology into the mix.
Yes.
And they suggest that certain astrological placements could indicate a lower sex drive or a predisposition towards asexuality,
Okay.
like Venus,
Okay.
the planet of love and pleasure being in certain houses or signs.
It's interesting.
They specifically mention Venus in Virgo or Pisces,
Okay.
or in the 6th house.
Got it.
Of course, astrology is a complex system
It is.
with many interpretations.
I mean,
So it shouldn't be taken as gospel.
right.
But for those who find meaning in astrology, I think it can be another interesting lens
I think so too.
through which to view these topics.
Absolutely.
And it is a good reminder
Yes.
that, there are so many layers to understanding
Yeah.
human behavior
Mm-hmm.
and that we're all unique.
We are.
What might resonate for one person won't necessarily resonate for another.
Absolutely.
Astro Martine also talks about karmic signs,
Okay.
Scorpio and Aquarius,
Interesting.
and they suggest that these signs might relate to perceiving relationships as burdens or experiencing a sense of loss in this area of life.
Interesting.
And they tied this back to asexuality by suggesting that individuals with strong Scorpio or Aquarius placements might be more content with solitude
Oh,
or less focused on romantic partnerships.
interesting.
So it's fascinating to kind of consider those connections.
It is.
But ultimately,
Yeah.
there's no single explanation for why someone might be asexual.
There isn't. No.
It's this complex interplay
Yeah.
of personal experiences, societal influences, maybe even astrological factors for some people.
Absolutely.
So as we continue kind of exploring these nuances, it's important to keep that complexity in mind.
I agree.
Now, religion, I think, is another important aspect of this conversation
Yeah.
because the concept of celibacy comes up a lot in religious contexts.
Absolutely.
So I think it's worth exploring how that intersects with asexuality.
Yeah, definitely. The channel podcast actually dives into this historical connection between asexuality and religious celibacy,
Right.
especially within Christianity.
They talk about how in the past, choosing a religious life
Yeah.
often meant avoiding marriage and sex.
Right.
But
Yeah.
while this might have been a path for some asexual individuals throughout history, it's important to remember that people had all sorts of reasons for joining religious orders back then.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
As Heather Rose Jones points out, it's tough to look back
Yeah.
and try to identify
Yeah.
historical examples of asexuality. Definitively.
It is.
Like the social norms and understandings of sexuality were just so different.
Yeah,
Plus, those norms were often very closely tied to religious beliefs.
absolutely.
And those ties still exist today. The channel highlights how many religions still very much emphasize traditional gender roles, marriage, and procreation,
Yes.
which can be incredibly difficult for those who identify as asexual
Yeah.
and just don't fit into those expectations.
Yeah, I can see that.
Living Purified actually comes at this from a Christian perspective in their video, and they respond to a commenter who identifies as asexual and is considering permanent celibacy. And I think it's great how they emphasize understanding your motivations.
Yes.
Like, are you choosing celibacy because of a genuine lack of sexual attraction, or are there maybe some past traumas that are influencing your decision? And they also advise seeking guidance, especially from a spiritual perspective, to make sure that this decision to embrace celibacy aligns with your faith.
Right.
And I think, importantly, they clarify that being asexual doesn't mean you can't have a fulfilling relationship or get married.
That's good.
They actually emphasize companionship and emotional intimacy
Yeah.
as essential needs that can be met in a marriage, even without sex.
Right. So it's not just like marriage requires sex.
Right.
It's more nuanced than that.
It's much more nuanced.
And they acknowledge that relationships can be adapted
Yeah.
to suit different needs and orientations.
And again, it circles back to that theme of open communication and understanding between partners. So what can we take away
Yeah.
from these different viewpoints on asexuality and religion?
I think the main takeaway is that there is no one-size-fits-all approach.
Right.
Each person's journey with their faith and sexuality is going to be unique.
And finding a path that feels authentic and aligns with their values and beliefs is crucial.
Absolutely.
Whether that means embracing celibacy, finding a partner who accepts their asexuality, or navigating the complexities of reconciling their identity with their faith.
Yes, and having a supportive community and resources can make all the difference when navigating these intersections.
Totally. Now let's kind of shift gears a bit
Yep.
and look at some of the broader societal and cultural implications of asexuality.
Yeah, let's do it.
The channel podcast poses this really thought-provoking question.
Okay.
Does the rise of asexuality, especially among young people, point towards a larger societal shift in attitudes about sex and relationships?
That is a good question.
It's a really interesting question, and they explore the idea that asexuality could be, in part, a reaction to the pressures and expectations of hookup culture.
Okay, I see.
Like, we're constantly bombarded with sexualized imagery and this emphasis on casual encounters.
Yeah.
And so maybe
some people are just like, I'm out.
yeah, like I'm out. And
Yeah.
one of their guests, Mary Harrington, she argues that, yeah, this constant bombardment of sexualized imagery might be leading some to withdraw from pursuing sex altogether.
Right. It's like asexuality is a rebellion in some way.
It's a rebellion against the prevailing norms.
Yeah, I like that.
And it makes you think about how technology,
Oh, yeah.
like the internet and online pornography,
Yeah.
might be shaping our understanding
Yeah.
and experience of sexuality.
Absolutely. They talk about digisexuality.
Oh, yeah?
Where people prefer to engage with sex remotely, through
Yeah.
online platforms. It really
It blurs those lines.
blurs the lines. Yeah.
Right. And it just shows how technology is impacting even our most intimate connections.
Absolutely.
And Harrington also brings up this idea called the law of conservation of desire,
Okay.
suggesting that the more we focus on online sexual pursuits, the less we have available for real-life relationships and intimacy.
Okay.
It's a pretty big question, right?
It is.
How is technology affecting our social lives
Right.
and our well-being?
Yeah, for sure.
So while they're kind of focusing on those potential societal shifts
Yeah.
that are driving asexuality, they also look at it from a historical perspective,
Okay.
pointing out that history is full of these cycles
Yeah.
of sexual liberation and repression.
Right.
So maybe asexuality is just part of that natural
And
ebb and flow
Yeah.
of societal attitudes towards sex and relationships.
Makes sense.
It reminds us that to really understand human sexuality,
Yeah.
we need to look beyond just current trends and consider those broader historical and cultural forces that are at play.
For sure.
Now, another really important aspect to consider is how gender intersects with asexuality.
Oh, absolutely.
And the channel podcast really gets into this. They talk about how asexuality can be especially challenging for women
Mm-hmm.
in a society that often equates a woman's worth
Yes.
with her sexual attractiveness and availability.
Yeah.
It's like women are constantly
Under pressure.
under pressure
To conform.
to conform to these standards of beauty and behavior.
Absolutely.
And those pressures are even more intense
Yeah.
when it comes to dating and relationships.
Oh, for sure.
And one of their guests, Mary Wakefield, she actually suggests that society might have almost invented asexuality
Okay.
as a way for women to opt out
Oh, wow.
of those pressures.
That's a really interesting take.
It is, right.
Yeah.
It's a very provocative thought that maybe asexuality is, in part, a response to the objectification
Yeah.
and sexualization
Yeah.
that women often face.
That makes a lot of sense.
It does, right.
Yeah.
And it makes you realize
Mm.
just how deeply gender roles and societal norms
Yeah.
can impact how individuals
Yeah.
experience and express their sexuality.
For sure.
So what can we conclude about the relationship between asexuality and gender?
Well, I think it's clear that gender plays a significant role in shaping how asexuality is perceived and experienced.
Right.
Asexual women, in particular, often face unique challenges,
Yes.
navigating a world that prioritizes their sexuality over other qualities.
Totally.
So it's important that we acknowledge those challenges
Yes.
and make space for open discussions about how these issues intersect.
Absolutely. And I think now another layer of complexity that we need to consider
Okay.
is when asexuality intersects with other LGBTQ plus identities.
Yes, absolutely.
Like, we need to talk about asexual individuals
Mhm.
who also identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender,
Right.
because this intersection brings up some really fascinating challenges
It does.
to our traditional assumptions about sexuality and identity.
Yeah, because people often assume that anyone who identifies as LGBTQ plus must be sexually active
Yes.
and interested in romantic relationships.
Right, and that can be incredibly isolating
It can be.
for those who identify as both
Yeah.
LGBTQ plus and asexual.
Yeah, you're kind of caught in the middle there.
Yeah, like you might feel invisible or misunderstood
Yeah.
in both communities.
Absolutely.
And it's just a good reminder that identities are complex.
Yes.
Like one person can be asexual and gay, asexual and trans, or any combination.
Right. They're not mutually exclusive.
They're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
And I think this highlights the importance of creating space for individuals
Yeah.
to define their own identities in their own terms
Absolutely.
without being forced into these boxes.
Yes, for sure.
And speaking of recognizing the diversity within the asexual community,
Yes.
let's talk about the spectrum of experiences and identities that exist.
Okay, let's do it.
Because the Psych2Go video gives a really helpful overview of this,
Mhm.
and they explain that asexuality is not a monolithic experience.
Right. Some people identify as completely asexual, meaning they experience no sexual attraction
All.
at all.
And then others might identify as gray sexual or demisexual,
Right.
meaning they only experience sexual attraction in very specific contexts or under certain conditions.
Yeah, and the channel podcast actually expands on this,
Okay.
with Heather Rose Jones pointing out historical examples that could potentially fit under the asexuality umbrella. Like, she talks about Boston marriages.
Right, those long-term committed relationships.
Yeah, between women.
Between women in the 19th century.
That weren't expected to be sexual.
Right, and I think these historical examples challenge this idea that asexuality is a new phenomenon.
I agree.
It's more likely that people have always experienced and expressed their sexuality in diverse ways,
Mhm.
and that our language and understanding are finally catching up.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So what can we learn from exploring the spectrum of asexuality?
I think it's important to remember that it isn't black and white.
Right.
There is a whole range of experiences and identities within the community, and each person's journey is going to be unique.
Yeah, so we need to avoid making assumptions about what it means to be asexual
Absolutely.
and respect how individuals define and express their own identities.
Yes, and we need more open dialogue
Yes.
and education to really help people understand
Yeah,
the complexities and nuances of asexuality.
absolutely. It's really interesting as we've been going through these videos. One thing that's really stood out to me is how much this conversation about asexuality kind of challenges some of our deepest assumptions about human nature.
Yeah, that's a great point. You know, we're so often brought up to believe that everyone experiences sexual attraction.
Right.
It's this fundamental aspect of being human.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But asexuality completely flips that script, you know?
Mhm.
It shows us that human experiences are way more diverse than we might initially think.
It's a huge realization, And it really broadens our understanding of what it means to be human. And I think it opens up possibilities for different ways of relating to ourselves and others.
Totally. And it also makes us reconsider our ideas about relationships.
Right.
We often automatically connect romantic relationships with sexual intimacy.
Of course.
But like we've seen in these videos, that's not the only way to experience love, connection, and fulfillment.
Right. Tara Chantel talked about feeling very complete and whole without a romantic partner.
Yes.
And finding deep satisfaction in her spiritual practice and her purpose in life.
And living purified emphasized that, asexual individuals can have fulfilling relationships, even marriages, without a sexual component.
Yeah, exactly.
And these perspectives, I think, really challenge us to think outside the box and recognize that there are many paths to happiness and fulfillment.
Absolutely.
It kind of frees us from that pressure of conforming to this one model of what a good life or a successful relationship should look like.
Sure.
One of the most powerful themes, I think, that emerged from these videos was this idea of self-acceptance.
Yeah, absolutely. And Tara Fantel especially, she spoke so beautifully about her journey of embracing her asexuality and finding pride in who she is.
Yes.
She talked about the difficulties of navigating a world that doesn't always understand or accept her choices, but also the strength and empowerment that she found in owning her truth.
And she encouraged others to do the same, to find the courage to embrace their own unique identities, even when they go against the grain.
That's a powerful message.
It is. And it reminds us that self-acceptance is a journey, and it's not always easy.
No, it's not.
But it's so worth it.
Absolutely.
When we can fully accept ourselves, it allows us to have deeper connections, I think, both with ourselves and with other people.
And it creates a ripple effect.
Yes.
It inspires others to do the same.
Totally. And, thinking about these messages of self-acceptance and challenging assumptions, it makes me wonder about their implications for society as a whole.
Okay, yeah, that's a really important point to consider. How do you think these messages can contribute to creating a more just and equitable world?
I think that when we start to question our assumptions about human nature, we become more open to empathy and understanding.
Yeah, for sure.
And we're less likely to judge or discriminate against those who are different from us.
Absolutely. And when we embrace the diversity of human experiences, I think we create a more inclusive and welcoming world for everyone.
And I think that's really at the heart of this conversation about asexuality. It's about expanding our understanding of what it means to be human.
Yes.
It's about challenging norms and making space for differences.
Absolutely.
It's about recognizing and celebrating the unique beauty of each individual. And ultimately, I think it's about creating a world where everyone can live authentically and fully without fear of judgment or rejection.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought.
Please do.
May we all continue to learn, grow, and evolve in our understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
And may we always strive to build a world that is more just, more equitable, and more loving for everyone.
Yes. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of asexuality.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep embracing the beauty of human diversity.